So before our final panel session, we've got Dr. Jonathan Gaylor from Affinity Shipbrokers in London. Jonathan is their gas market research analyst, and quite apart from their shipbroking and gas market expertise, I would recommend you visit Affinity Shipbrokers in London on a clear day, because they have an absolutely awesome view of the City of London in a building that's called the Cheesebreaker. Oh, Cheesebreaker. Cheesebreaker. Which floor is it?
44th.
44th floor. It's a great view. Jonathan?
Thank you.
Jonathan, he's going to talk to us about gas markets today and tomorrow.
Again, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to talk with you all today. My name is Jonathan Gaylor. I work for Affinity Shipbroking based in London, as we said. It's headed up by Richard Fulford-Smith. I currently work on both the LNG desk and the research, and I urge you, if you don't know any of our research reports, please feel free to reach out anytime during this, after the talk, for instance, and we'll happily show you what we do. Now, I understand that a lot of you are also here from the LPG market, and I thought of a topic that kind of like amalgamates both the LNG and the LPG markets is really the upstream side. So where is all the new source going to come from? Now, this presentation, it isn't about immediate consequences. We're not suddenly going to get a lot of LNG production from what I'm about to show you, but show you far into the future what we could be getting. So I'll briefly talk about the LNG production right now, where we are, very briefly on the LPG production, but then really talk about the future supply, because obviously right now the LNG market is going through a change, and where can we envisage it to keep on growing in such an environment. I'll also talk about current exploration activities and the demand for that gas as well. So one of the largest stories really in the LNG market is the sheer amount of volume set to come on stream. If you look at this graph, by 2018, we should have around another 100 million tons per annum extra into the commodity. Now, most of this growth here, you'll see, because of the long lag time and lead time to projects being developed, these have all officially basically been given FID. So you don't have, like, for example, Canadian projects in our forecast, for instance, up to 2018. Most of this growth will be from the US towards the end of 2018 and Australia. Australia is set to become the #1 LNG exporter. There's two differences between both the Australian projects and the Australian. To start with, the Australian projects are vastly more costly, but only because they have to build the upstream portion for that feed gas itself. Now, the US LNG coming on stream has also brought in a new cost structure, one that's based on Henry Hub, but also they're usually on a brownfield site, and they're definitely cheaper, and they tend to use the feed gas. So if we look at the natural gas prices right now, the bottom line is the Henry Hub, so we'll start on that one. Henry Hub has been extremely low at the start of this year. Stockpiles have been going up, and right now we're on average under $2 for most of the year. Going forward, looking at average 2016 prices, the EIA predicts it will get to $2.50 by the end of this year. But so far it has been under $2 for quite some time. So if that is going to be the case, then we should see some spike above $2.50 towards the winter. One thing that I think we need to keep clear about the Henry Hub price gas right now, because of all the costs involved and the shipping, is the oil-linked contracts that actually seemed quite competitive to Asia. If the oil price was to increase, then the Henry Hub would be the more cost-effective region. And another thing is that if the oil price goes up, we'll start seeing more drilling again in the US, which will drive down Henry Hub down further because of all the quantities of associated gas being produced. NBP again as well also stayed relatively low at the moment as well due to insufficient demand as such, and also pretty much everywhere of the markets had like a warm winter. Similar story with both the Asian spot price and obviously the crude link price. Obviously that's linked to the oil, but spot price has been relatively low demand during 2015 with Korea, China and Japan. And this is in Japan and Korea especially, since they're now looking on their nuclear program. I think I'll quickly go over this LPG production. Many of you probably are more aware of it than I am. But going forward, we'll see significant growth probably from the US and also the Middle East. Now, the US, although the drilling has slowed down, there's actually a forecasted that it should technically drop around 350,000 barrels per day per year. But we don't assume that will really affect the LPG side because those wells and the refinery are basically where some of the money is right now. So we don't see the LPG dropping off, for instance, from America. Now, in the Middle East, they won't come from traditional exporters, but the main drive will come from Iran as they're keen to develop their South Pars field. So right now, the gas prices are quite low, and things are quite costly in the LNG market, so where could we envisage some future supply? One of the ways to look at this is really about the exploration and drilling itself. If we just look here, this is the international rotary rig count. Now, this has dropped dramatically from around 2014, and it's currently standing around 1,550 around then. So if we go from country to country, South America and Latin America, this has dropped off dramatically. Around 40% of their drilling and exploration so far has been dropped off. It's extremely expensive to drill in those areas, and it's not so cheap to... Basically, anything you'll find now will remain unexploitable due to the price. Africa has had 6 of the 10 largest known discoveries in the last couple of years, but also it's extremely costly also to drill there. In fact, the average, excluding Egypt, but the average exploration fee or the average exploration fund is around $35 per barrel. So, I mean, if you look at the oil price right now, there's a significant portion of that in just the exploration costs alone. When I was looking at particular projects in Africa a couple of years ago, there were wells being drilled at 140 million, and these had a 15% geological chance of actually encountering hydrocarbons. So you can see the risks that are involved, and you also have a lot of small E&P firms, and these ones have been the ones that are most hard hit during this crisis as well. But the majority of this drop is actually, in fact, obviously the American shales. It's dropped around 50% over last year, and we're looking at around 440 active rigs. The difference being, though, is that any inclination in the oil price, we do suddenly see an uptick in the number of drill rigs, rigs drilling in the US, and we're going to see a faster uptake in that area compared to other countries. Just before I go on to the next slide, I thought it would be good to have a quick definition of what I mean by wet gas and what I mean by dry gas. Dry gas is predominantly pure methane. You're looking around 99%. Hardly needs really any work to do. It's more close enough to gas pipeline quality. Might have some qualities such as being sour, for high sulfur content as in the Middle East, but essentially this is what a lot of the new LNG production is being produced from. Wet gas is primarily composed of methane, but around below 85%, and in that you can also include the ethane, propane, butane, and pentane. In a conventional field, I think if we think of a conventional field as one as the Middle East, where you put your straw in and the oil comes out, you tend to normally have like one or each. And that's quite a gross generalization. But in terms of a shale, you tend to have the whole thermal structure. So what I mean by thermal structure is dry gas is predominantly made in a thermally mature environment, so quite hot, and while the oil, for instance, is more of a thermally cool environment. And if you look, this is the Marcellus Shale, you tend to have all amalgamations of oil grades from dry gas up to oil itself. And this allows also drillers to be able to target basically the best, the one that will bring the best return of investment. So we're in shipping, there's no need really for me to look at exploration at the center of Mongolia. We also need to start looking at countries really with insufficient demand but large quantities of the stuff. So basically we need to find places that are stranded, basically uncommercial, and this really brings us to the main continent, which is Africa. So I'll briefly talk about the exploration activities and the finds we're expecting. If I start with Mauritania, Senegal, they've recently discovered a 17 TCF. So if we think TCF, trillion cubic feet, that equals to around 1 million tons per annum produced for over 20 years. So 17 TCF is a significant amount of gas. This is a dry gas. Now, why do we foresee that this will be exported? Well, Mauritania, Senegal also discovered a dry gas field a couple of years ago called the Banda Gas Complex. This has already been eyed up for development, and this will be plenty to feed the local population as is, and there's no really sufficient demand around that area. So this was going to have to be developed somehow for export. We go along the coast to Equatorial Guinea. This is, I believe, about 3.4 TCF field. This has already been eyed up for an FLNG, so I'm not really going to dwell too much on this one. Now, Angola and Namibia. Angola, at the moment, in the last month actually, with Sonangol and in BP, they've discovered, I believe, around 8 TCF dry gas field, but they've also found condensates and wet gas of substantial quantity in that area. And Namibia itself hasn't really been explored as much as Angola, but the one thing I'd like to highlight is the fact that Angola and Namibia should be as basically profitable as if you look at Brazil. So when these basins were formed back in geological time, they were formed basically at the same time, and due to plate tectonics have separated over time. So the success we've seen in the pre-salts, for instance, in South America, we should be seeing in Namibia and Angola. But the amount of wells alone that have been drilled is very few and far between, in particular in Namibia. These pre-salt wells are extremely deep, extremely expensive, but one property of the pre-salt itself is it provides a sufficient cap rock, which stops basically the oil or gas migrating upwards further, but it also dissipates heat quite well. So we're more likely to find more of the wet gas and the oil grades in that area. I don't really foresee that we're going to see anything soon, especially from Namibia, due to the sheer drilling costs and the risks involved. East Africa, everyone knows about the large gas accumulation, so I'm not going to dwell on that. However, what they also have is they do have certain oil seeps certain out, and what we expect is the fact that further off the coast you're more likely to get heavier grade or more oil and more wet gas, because at the moment they're finding dry gas. But again, the drilling is extremely expensive on this, and this is really more of a way of if it's going to be successful or not. First, they need to develop the dry gas. I've just briefly included Iran. This is just more of a speaking additional point to say, they are going to develop the South Pars, and they are going to be looking to have, same success as Qatar in terms of their LNG. Obviously, it's going to take some time, but you're going to get sufficient amount of condensates and gas coming out that area. Now, East Mediterranean is probably a bit more of my background. I think this follows nicely from the last presentation in the fact that right now it's a perfect environment as such for a small scale, but actually it's even better than that. So when I return to the East, when I talk about the East Mediterranean, I'm talking about an area called the Levant Basin. So this is where all these gas finds have been found so far. And it stretches really from about Egyptian maritime border all the way up to Lebanon. If we start with Lebanon as a whole, there's had 7 wells drilled in the offshore region. I think in the 1960s to the 1980s, hardly anything's been done apart from geophysical results. And now the new geophysical results are basically showing oil seeps over known fractured areas, which means that we're probably looking at a more wet gas, unlike what we've been finding in Cyprus and Egypt, which is predominantly dry. Cyprus itself has the Aphrodite field. Again, that's currently sitting stranded with no FID. Initially, that could have been set up to export into Egypt. However, that won't be the case with the find of the Zohr field in Egypt. So we've got, 4.5 TCF from the Aphrodite field. But on top of that, a lot of, apparently at the recent conference, some geophysics noted there's around 6 to 7 Zohr-like geological structures, which are dry, which will be predominantly dry. So exploration in Cyprus is such at the early stages that I truly believe that we're going to be finding a lot more gas in that area. And same with Egypt, and the same with Israel as well. There's a lot more, I believe, to come out the East Mediterranean, and already those fields in Israel, for instance, is way beyond what their demand is as well. Following on from that, everyone kind of, wants to hop on the shale game. Well, not all shales are the same. If we start with Canada, there's a lot of plausible LNG projects out there, which none have obtained FID yet. The actual reserves in Canada keep on growing. A recent assessment of the Lloyd Basin straddling British Columbia and Alberta is actually around 218 TCF worth of dry gas alone. But there's no really demand from its southern neighbour anymore. But if we were to look at every single project, let's say 4 months ago, that was on the cards for Canada, they'd need around 6.4 billion cubic feet per day to supply all these LNG plants. Right, to supply all those LNG plants, they would require 700 wells to be drilled every year. And at the moment, there's 40 drill rigs working, and there's been a drop-off of around 80% of drilling. So the sheer feasibility of all these projects happening is not there at the moment. However, the volumes are. The US, the reason I've included the US is just they've still got significant amounts of gas. They tend to have cheaper projects at the moment compared to worldwide. And if the oil price was to go up, Henry Hub would again start to become more commercial, and we could start seeing projects in the future as well be driven. Now, in terms of the worldwide shales, the Vaca Muerta is based in Argentina. Its reserve size from between 300 to 800 TCF, which would make it bigger than the Eagle Ford or the Barken. Geologically speaking, it's quite similar to the US, and recent wells drilled there have been actually quite reliable. So in a worldwide sense, apart from Canada and the US or North America, it should be the Vaca Muerta that will have the next success. However, Argentina is pretty much closed to the capital markets, essentially. So what they've been doing is getting investment from a lot of the upstream players. They've seemed to also de-link their gas price from the worldwide market, and gas will be priced at $7.50 for unconventional resources, which makes drilling in these unconventional resources more profitable and more likely to happen. So we should see some production in the long term from there. Russia and Australia also have significant amounts of gas still left, but the problem is the cost involved in the upstream portion in Australia will be limiting that for some time. We've already seen quite a few projects, such as the Browse, being placed on the back burner for some time. I didn't include it, but just another scenario is China. Everyone does like to talk about their shale as well. Geological standpoint is very different to the North American or Vaca Muerta. It's harder, it's more, it's further away from the source, and it hasn't really got, it's more compartmentalized, hasn't really got the water as well to really be pumping into these wells. So that's going to be a long time. How do we get this gas out the ground? How does it become commercial and not stranded? It has to be cost effective. I don't think for the next couple of years we're going to be seeing Gorgon-like projects being sanctioned on FID. But again, it's a different time. Whatever projects we do get over the next couple of years obtaining FID, it's with the knowledge of today's gas prices. When these projects were sanctioned a couple of years ago, I remember looking through annual reports, for instance, and their low case scenario, not for the LNG projects, but as a whole wide industry, low cases were done on $100 barrel oil. So you can see that anything that will obtain FID going onwards will be a lot more reliable. People still have to be cash rich and access to the capital markets. LNG is not the cheap game. And they have to be flexible. We're going to have to start seeing a lot more flexibility. People are less likely to be signing 20-year contracts, for instance, for oil linked. We're going to probably see more pricing structures, but on top of that, the duration. With FSRUs there, people aren't looking for 20-year contracts on for importing FSRU, such as Egypt, looking at 5 years. One way to capitalize on that gas would be to use an FLNG. I tend to use the terms conversion and fully integrated right now. They're not the proper terms, so perhaps don't go away saying that. But the conversion is a Moss-type carrier. You're looking at using a dry gas, so only suitable for dry gas fields, unless you do some more processing on shore. The fully integrated is more where, for example, the wet gas can be used and the condensates were also being able to be extracted. Both are very different in terms of their cost. However, your upsides on your condensates will negate some of that cost on the fully integrated project. And to be honest, some of these projects won't be able to go ahead without having a fully integrated prelude-like structure. Right now, the FLNG units are being eyed up for Africa. Quite a lot of the, the Coral FLNG recently announced by Eni. You've got one in Cameroon, a potential one as well in Equatorial Guinea, which is great. And the one thing I have shown as well is that, a lot of these new gas finds are being found in Africa. Some of these countries are slightly a bit more risky to be invested in, and the fact that you've got a movable asset also negates some of that risk. I'll quickly talk about demand because there's no point producing supply if there isn't sufficient demand. This is just from the BP Outlook, but basically Asia Pacific will have the biggest growth in terms of liquids and natural gas. We are in a good situation in LNG in the fact that it's not being legislated against. We're not diesel, we're not coal, so we see significant drive in that. But again, how do we get people, into the LNG market or gas? It still has to be cost effective. Gas prices are very cheap at the moment, but you know what? So are other things. So is coal and so is oil. So it still has to be cost effective to them. They have to be resilient to increase in prices. There's no point signing up a 20-year contract linked on oil and then suddenly oil shoots up and you found out that you actually is quite expensive. It has to be environmentally sound, which LNG generally is, and quick to come on stream. This is two reasons. You shouldn't be selling a project based on the cheap gas prices because that might not last, but why not capitalize on that right now? Egypt as a whole, I think they signed their first FSRU, and within 6 months they were already importing LNG, so it's a quick turnaround. If we look at the planned FSRU projects, we have Puerto Rico, Colombia, Chile, 2 in Ghana, and 1 in Bangladesh. But it's a market that's always increasing. The FSRUs themselves are getting bigger, and more people are looking at as an easy way to start importing the fuel. So where do we see also potential demand going? Everyone knows pretty obvious, but the reason I say South America quite a lot is the fact that their gas network in terms of pipeline infrastructure and that is quite poor in certain areas, to say the least. However, there is sufficient demand still for electricity. Now, hydro is quite big in South America, but when there's a drought, it's not very useful. And so we've seen that, in numerous countries at various stages. And so having, for example, an FSRU close to a major city or port in the area around South America will give significant demand. We have some demand as well, a bit more localized in Ghana, for instance. Ghana also claimed their first 250 megawatt gas-fired power barge, for instance. So it's another good way of bringing gas into the various markets by just basically bringing the power to them. The biggest growths are still, Pakistan and India have been very good, in fact soaking up those excess volumes in the last year. This trend is set to continue. India's got 7 out of the top 10 most polluted cities, all spewing out dirty coal-fired power plants that are really up for renewal, and why not use gas as that feedstock? China, 2015, had relatively low demand. It was slipping in terms of natural gas, but already recently we've started seeing that come off and we're starting to see them increase. Their next 5-year plan, which started this year, which they tend to actually follow quite closely, also has natural gas high on the agenda, and so we're going to start seeing a lot more imports going into this country. So really, it's a bit weird talking about, extra supply in an already technically oversupplied market with little demand, but at the end of the day, demand is going to grow, and people can't get used to the cheap gas prices because at the moment a lot of these projects aren't getting sanctioned, or new projects getting sanctioned, and there could be a time that it will fall out balanced again. Okay. Just a quick plug about Affinity. On the LNG team ourselves, we're a fully integrated broker. We're not just there for the shipping. We are able to understand the upstream elements and to end users, because in the LNG business, it's very much got to be, you're not going to have new supply if you don't have an end buyer, but you can't have a buyer if you don't have the supply. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Jonathan, thank you very much. That was excellent. Can I suggest we go straight into the panel session now? And there any questions you've got for Dr. Gaylor are addressed as we go through the panel session. So could Messrs. Bafias, Hadjipateras and Vlachos please join